In this series, we've gone through many plugins that have MPE capabilities, and we've seen how to put the morph into MPE mode and use MPE standards to quickly assign gestures to parameters and synthesizers. In this case, we're going to dial it back and use simpler equipment, but we still want to use some of those expressive gestures that we found in MPE. We can do this with simple plugins, but in this case, I wanted to show some inexpensive hardware and how we can take advantage of their MIDI implementations and use those to get expressive play from the morph to control and play different inexpensive synths. In this setup, I have the MIDI Geode, which is a really simple sort of bass synthesizer, monophonic. I have the Volca Beats, which is a very basic drum machine. And I have the Roland SH01A, which is a polyphonic synthesizer modeled on some older classic designs from Roland, but it is polyphonic instead of the original monophonic 101. I'll first demonstrate some of the expressive things, and then we'll go through a couple of the equipment things, and then we'll show what the mappings look like and how we made them on the morph. The music production overlay is mapped to channel 2 on the Geode, and so we'll use that to control the Geode's, basically the knobs with the pads and with the knobs on the music production overlay. The Buchla Thunder is sending on channel 1, and we're using the XYZ in an MPE way, but it is monophonic. So we have the filter control on the Y and pitch on X, and then we have the oscillator mix on the Z, which is kind of subtle, but it does offer varied timbres. We can also use the hex pads to control some of the front-facing dials. The Volca Beats, we have X and Y mapped in different ways. It has pretty limited MIDI options, but we can still use it to do expressive things with volume and with decay and the repeat and get all of those controls in a playable surface rather than in the tiny knobs of the Volca. We can also play things in ways that we don't normally get out of the Volca Beats because we can do the pitch bend on the pads themselves. In order to get MIDI out to the synthesizers, we go USB MIDI out from the morph into a device that can host the USB MIDI and turn it into regular 5-pin MIDI. In this case, we're using a device from RetroKits called the RK005, but there are others available, such as from Excel Valley and Kenton USB. The MIDI then goes into the Geode and the Korg Volca Beats and into the Roland SH01A. Once you have everything hooked up, you're going to need to find out how a particular synth responds to MIDI. Generally, that's usually pretty simple to find. Either look for the manual or look for a MIDI implementation. This usually takes you straight to what you need. In this case, the Volca Beats, there's a PDF on the Korg site that we find here in our first results, at least in my first results. And it takes us to a very basic chart. What we're going to look for is the control change messages. Look to see if it responds to aftertouch, which it does not. And if it responds to pitch bend, which it does not. And so we get a sense of what we can control. Here's the control change messages. So we can send CC 40 to 49 to do part level. So there is a way to get some sort of volume control, as well as PCM speed. So that has sort of a pitch control. Once we find that we have some basic parameters that we can mess with, we can then apply those in the Sensel app. So in the Sensel app, you'll probably want to start from scratch just by adding an overlay, and in this case, a drum MIDI. And then from here, you'll want to probably change the different types to accommodate different types of controls. So XYZ will then give you some different controls that you can map to those CCs. In the end, the decisions I made are outlined in this graphic here. So if we take a look at, you can see that the kick and the snare are in traditional places. We have toms, so all the playback things are kind of in obvious places. The hats are up in the corner, but we have some additional controls that we've mapped to the CC. So we can take a look at the Sensel map, and I have the drum Volca Beats. This is an XYZ control, but I have pressure and X off, and then Y is going to CC40, which is volume for the bass drum kick. Other interesting things, we have a control here that uses pressure and the X value to control the stutter knobs on the Volca Beats. So this you can do in combination while playing for some interesting effects. Up here, we use the CC for the decay on the toms, so they're almost like these little cuticle areas or sliders. And then the hi-hats, we have the Y mapped to the decay, so we can get a little bit of variation even though it's kind of subtle. So these are some of the things that we can map, and in the example, you can hear a lot of these things, particularly the pitch changes on the bell and the agogo and the claves. In the case of the Roland SH1001A, again, that was a matter of finding the implementation. So Roland SH01A MIDI implementation. And this nicely pulls up a PDF and a chart we can look at. Again, lots of control changes that we can use to manipulate sound. This is, in some ways, the hardest part, is making these decisions, what you want to actually control with your key presses and your gestures. Unfortunately, these are not polyphonic expression, but it's still super cool to be able to play these instruments in ways that really they were almost never intended to be controlled by. This is kind of a quick overview of how to do these things. If you wanted to do something like a Dave Smith mofo, you can again see that this has a much more sophisticated MIDI implementation. And you can do things like use standard control messages. So many patches will be pre-programmed to record or respond to mod wheel, breath controller, foot controller in certain ways. And so if you make your morph, send those on your X, Y, and Z gestures, every patch is probably going to do something kind of interesting. Or if you want to control something very specific on every patch, if you always want the vertical to be frequency on the oscillator or on the filter, you would want to map that to CC102. So you would simply select CC102 in your controller here, and then that would control the filter. So by using these strategies, we can really get some wonderful sounds out of synthesizers that we probably normally would not.